I can still hear the creak of the wooden pews and smell the faint sweetness of Sister Marlene's cornbread, the one she always brought for the church potlucks. It was a Sunday like any other. Except it wasn't. That morning, I had walked into New Light Missionary Baptist Church, holding my head up high, dressed in my best lavender dress, pressed just right, with a brooch my mama left me pinned near my heart. But when the doors closed behind me and the whispers began to grow louder than the hymns, I knew something had changed. Something ugly was about to bloom. Before I go on, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I'd love to know who's out there hearing this story with their heart. Let me take you back a bit. My name is Loretta Mae Jackson, born in 1948 in a small town just outside Jackson, Mississippi. I grew up with red dirt roads, screen doors slamming shut, and the ever-present hum of gospel songs floating through the air like a prayer too stubborn to quit. Church wasn't just a place for us, it was the place. We got baptized there, we grieved there, we celebrated, and sometimes we even fought, but always we forgave, or so I thought. From as young as I can remember, Mama would press my hair every Saturday night and lay out my Sunday shoes by the fire. "A girl who fears the Lord," she'd say, "ain't got no reason to fear the world." I clung to her words like scripture itself. But life has a cruel way of twisting the truth when people start confusing God with gossip. I was 28 when I married Isaiah. Tall, proud, voice like velvet, and hands that built houses with the strength of a storm. Everyone said we looked like a dream together. And for a while, we were. Sundays at church with his hand firm on my back, singing hymns side by side, cooking for the elders, organizing youth retreats. I was a deacon's wife. That meant something. At least it used to. But then came that year, 1983. The year I learned what it meant to have your name dragged through red clay and judgment. It started with whispers. First, it was just Sister Eloise glancing sideways when I passed. Then, Pastor Jones's prayers started sounding more like warnings. "The devil walks in high heels and speaks in sweet tones," he'd say from the pulpit, eyes locked on mine. I laughed it off. At first. But then Isaiah came home late, too often. He stopped praying before meals. He stopped touching me altogether. Then came the accusation. A note slipped under the church office door. Anonymous. Cowardly. It claimed I had seduced a young choir boy, Marcus, barely 17. I nearly dropped the casserole I was carrying when Pastor Jones called me into his office. He didn't ask me what happened. He asked me why. I told him I didn't even know Marcus like that. I'd taught him Sunday school, like I had a dozen other boys. That child never looked at me with anything but respect. But once a seed of doubt is planted in dry soil, it don't take much to grow into poison. They held a special meeting that Sunday. I wasn't allowed to speak. I wasn't allowed to cry. Just sit there while grown folks who'd shared my table cast stones like they were earning badges in righteousness. Isaiah never stood up for me, just kept his eyes on the floor like it was going to open up and swallow him whole. And then, the banishment. Pastor Jones stood, robe billowing like he was Moses himself, and said, I had brought shame to the house of the Lord, that I was no longer welcome, no apology, no trial, just exile. They didn't even let me pick up my Bible. I walked home. That day passed the same houses I had delivered pies to, babysat children in, prayed for. Doors closed, curtains twitched, the scent of Marlene's cornbread still on my fingers, and yet I had never felt so far from home. That was just the beginning. You know, sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if I'd been born in another place. But Mississippi? Mississippi has a memory longer than the river it's named after, and it don't forget a thing, especially not if you're a black woman who talks back or stands too tall. I was the youngest of 5 girls. Our house was small, but our voices were loud, especially around supper. Mama ran the kitchen like a general. You could hear the clatter of pots from the porch, and if you were lucky, smell the beans and ham hock before the screen door flew open. We didn't have much, but we had rhythm. My sisters and I sang while hanging clothes, braided each other's hair on the porch, and swapped secrets under the covers late at night. Daddy was quiet, a railroad man. Gone more than he was home, but when he came through that door, Mama would stand just a little taller, wipe her hands on her apron, and hum a different tune. They had a love I didn't understand back then, full of silences that spoke louder than words. But the church? That was where my soul bloomed. I was 8 when I first sang solo. His eye is on the sparrow. My knees were knocking so hard I thought I'd faint. But Mama nodded from the front pew, and somehow the words poured out. After that, Sister Bernadette took me under her wing. She said I had an anointing, like a melody stitched into my bones. I didn't know what that meant, but I liked how it sounded, like I mattered. Church became my second home. I memorized every scripture, every hymn. I'd watch the older women, how they dressed, how they carried themselves with grace, even when the world didn't offer them much. I promised myself I'd be just like them. Strong, righteous, untouchable. But the world don't care about promises, especially not made by little black girls in cotton dresses. There were signs early, on little cracks in the glass, the way the pastor's wife, Sister Alma, would pinch my cheek a little too hard, the way Deacon Clyde's eyes lingered when I helped pour the sweet tea at picnics. I didn't have the words for it back then, but I felt it, unspoken warnings, like the hush that falls just before a summer storm. When I turned 15, the Itoi first boy I loved was named Reggie. He gave me a dandelion once and said it matched the sun in my smile. I pressed it into my Bible and read Psalms every night, thinking that maybe God had made us for each other. But Mama found one of his notes, folded, like a secret, sweet as sugar, and burned it right there in the sink. "Ain't no man thinking holy thoughts at your age," she said. "Keep your legs closed and your prayers open." I learned that love, real or imagined, was dangerous for girls like me. And reputation? Reputation was everything. Still, I kept dreaming. I wanted to be a teacher, wanted to wear high heels and stand tall in a classroom, molding little minds like Miss Green had done for me. But money was tight. Dreams didn't pay for shoes or supper. So I cleaned houses after school, sang in choir on Sundays, and told myself that one day God would make a way. That way came in the form of Isaiah. I met him at a revival meeting when I was 19. He was 25, already a man in the eyes of the church. He had on a gray suit and the kind of voice that could make thunder seem polite. He said I looked like a psalm in motion. I didn't know what that meant, but it made my knees go soft. We courted for a year, always with someone watching, always with space between us. He said he wanted to do it the right way, that he wanted our union to be blessed, not tainted. I thought that meant love. I thought that meant safety. The wedding was in spring. The lilies matched the ribbon on my dress, and I remember thinking that I was stepping into a future painted by God himself. But it didn't take long for that paint to chip. Isaiah wasn't cruel, not at first, just distant. He liked things. Quiet, liked control. When I spoke too loud or laughed too hard, he'd place his hand on my shoulder just a little too firm. "A deacon's wife should know her place," he'd say. And I tried. Lord knows I tried. I smiled when I wanted to cry. I served when I wanted to rest. I stayed silent when my spirit screamed. Because in our world, a woman's worth is measured in how much she can bear before breaking. I bore everything, until I couldn't. The thing about a lie is that it never comes dressed as one. It don't knock on your door and announce itself. It seeps in slow, like water under a porch. By the time you notice the rot, it's already in your bones. It started with Marcus. Sweet boy. Always polite, always early to choir practice, always helping the older deacons move chairs before service. I saw myself in him sometimes, eager, wide-eyed, trying to find his place in a world that didn't offer many. His mama had passed when he was just 12. That boy clung to the church like a raft in the flood, and I took care of him the way I did all the youth in our ministry. I made sure he had clean choir robes. I packed him an extra sandwich on youth retreat trips. I even gave him a birthday card one year with a verse from Jeremiah inside. For I know the plans I have for you. Apparently, someone didn't like that. One Tuesday morning, while I was mopping the fellowship hall, alone as always, Pastor Jones came in with a look I had only seen once before, when a man confessed to beating his wife during testimony service. He held a note in his hand like, it was burning him, it was short, just a few lines. It said I had been inappropriate with Marcus, that I had crossed boundaries unfit for a godly woman. No name signed, no proof, just ink and spite. I laughed at first, truly. I thought it was a prank, something the youth had cooked up for fun maybe, but Pastor didn't laugh. He said they had no choice but to investigate, that I should step back from my roles for a season. A season. As if my whole life, my reputation, my service, my faith, was a shirt to be folded and placed in the back of a drawer. When I told Isaiah, he just stared at the wall. Didn't even ask me if it was true. Just said, "You must have done something to make them think that way." That hurt worse than the accusation. I tried to reach Marcus. I wanted to look that boy in the eye and ask him if he believed what they were saying. But his aunt, who'd taken him in after his mama passed, refused to let me see him. "Don't come near this house," she said, "or I'll call the law." That's when I knew. This wasn't about truth. It was about control, about fear, about a church too proud to admit it could be wrong, too bound by its own image to see the woman who had fed its children, mended its robes, and cleaned its floors. The whispers turned into looks. The looks turned into silence. Sisters I'd prayed with for decades wouldn't even meet my eyes. Then came the final blow. A disciplinary meeting after Sunday service. The sanctuary emptied fast that day, like folks didn't want to catch what I had. They sat me in the front pew while Pastor, the deacons, and a few of the elder mothers looked down at me like I was dirt on their shoes. Pastor read from Titus about the conduct of women. Deacon Wilkins spoke about appearances and temptations. And then Sister Alma, who had never liked me, said, "Even if she didn't do it, the possibility brings shame." That was the nail. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to beg, but nothing came out. Just silence, the kind that suffocates. They told me not to return, said it was for the health of the congregation, that I could worship elsewhere. And just like that, my church, my home, banished me like I was leprosy wrapped in silk. Isaiah packed a bag and moved into his mother's house the next day. No explanation, no goodbye. I found myself standing alone in our kitchen, holding the now withered dandelion Reggie once gave me in a frame, wondering how a life so full could become so empty so fast. But it wasn't over. The worst was still to come. You don't know how loud silence can be until it's all you've got. The days after I was cast out blurred into a gray hush. My phone didn't ring. No one knocked on the door. Not even Sister Geraldine, who used to borrow sugar like it was a weekly appointment. It was like I had died, but my body didn't get the message. I stopped singing. The house was too quiet without Isaiah's shoes thudding down the hallway. Too still without the rustle of Sunday clothes being laid out on Saturday nights. The lavender dress I'd worn to that last service still hung on the back of the door, wrinkled and abandoned, like a ghost too proud to leave. I stopped going. To the grocery store. Folks stared like I had horns on my head. Even the young cashier, who used to smile and ask about my cobbler recipe, now just scanned my items like she was afraid of catching sin from me. I had to find work, of course. Bills don't wait for heartbreak. So I started cleaning houses again. just like when I was a teenager, except now with a pain in my lower back and a heart too heavy to lift. Most folks paid me fair. A few shorted me. One woman left a note on the counter asking me not to use her bathroom. But the worst part wasn't the work. It was the Sundays. Every Sunday morning, I would wake up before dawn like I always had. My body didn't know how to sleep in on the Lord's Day. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, wrapped in a shawl, and listen. Just listen. The faint hum of choirs in the distance, the rumble of cars heading to service, children in patent, shoes skipping down the sidewalk, and me? Just a shadow on a porch, wrapped in shame. I thought about moving, starting over somewhere no one knew my name or the rumors tied to it. But every time I packed a box, I found something that rooted me. A photograph, a dish, a letter from one of the youth group girls thanking me for always listening. So I stayed. Then one day, I saw him. Marcus. It had been months. He was taller, older somehow, walking out of the corner store with a soda in one hand and sorrow in his eyes. He saw me and froze. I stood still too, like we were statues in a place time had forgotten. He crossed the street. "Miss Loretta," he said, voice barely a whisper. I didn't speak, just waited. I didn't write that letter," he said. "I swear to God, I don't know who did, but I never said anything bad about you." I felt my knees weaken. "Then why didn't you say something?" I asked. My voice cracked like old wood. "They told me not to," he said. "Said it was better if I stayed quiet, that I'd be protecting the church. I was scared." Of course he was. He was a child. And I had been their sacrifice. He cried, right there on the sidewalk. I hugged him, not for him, but for me, for the part of me that still believed in redemption, even in ashes. After that day, something inside me shifted. I started humming again while sweeping the floor, started reading my Bible out loud. Not for any congregation, just for the walls and the windows and the God I still believed in, even if his people had forgotten me. Then one Sunday, I did something I never thought I'd do. I walked into a different church. Not the grand one on Main Street, but a small, humble one by the train tracks. Wooden benches, no choir robes, just voices raised in raw praise. And they welcomed me. Didn't ask questions, didn't know my story. Just let me sit and sing. And for the first time in months, I felt seen, not judged, not watched, just seen. It wasn't home yet, but it was a beginning, and beginnings have power. It took time, years in fact, but wounds do scab, even if they leave a mark. That little church by the train tracks became more than a refuge. It became family, real family. The kind that doesn't care what the world says, just what your spirit shows. I never went back to New Light Missionary Baptist, not once. But they couldn't erase me. No matter how many sermons they preached or pews they dusted, my fingerprints were still on the hymnals, on the curtains I sewed with my own hands, on the very steps I had scrubbed on my knees. You don't get to rewrite truth just because it's uncomfortable. And one day, truth knocked back. It was at a women's revival conference hosted by my new church almost 5 years after my banishment. I had built a new life there, taught Sunday school again, led the choir, even started a mentorship group for girls who had no mothers to guide them. The theme that year was, "What the Fire Didn't Burn." I had no intention of speaking. But the pastor's wife, Sister Annette, told me that God had given me a word someone needed to hear. So I stood up. I stood before a room full of women, many who knew me only as Sister Loretta, the singer with the healing voice. And I told them the story. My story. Not the lie that had followed me like a shadow, but the truth, every splinter of it. I talked about the pain, the silence, the shame. But more than that, I talked about survival. How I found strength, not in vindication, but in restoration. How I stopped begging people to believe me and started believing in myself again. How I learned that grace isn't something the church gives, it's something God plants deep in your bones. The room was quiet. When I finished, some women cried, some stood. A few came up and said, "That was my story too." One woman even whispered, "I thought I was the only one." I wasn't. None of us are. Word spread after that, quietly but steadily. A few women from New Light came by my house, bringing baked goods and long silences. No one said sorry, not directly, but their eyes held it. One even asked if I'd come speak to the young girls at their summer camp. I smiled, thanked her, and politely declined. Sometimes healing means not going back. Isaiah never returned. I heard he remarried. I forgave him in a prayer once when the moon was high and I felt strong enough to mean it. As for Marcus, he's grown now. Teaches music at a high school, 2 counties over. Still sends me Christmas cards with little notes like, "You were my safe place." I kept them all in a box under my bed next to that old dandelion Reggie once gave me. Some things you don't keep because they're pretty. You keep them because they remind you who you used to be and how far you've come. Now, I'm a grandmother. My granddaughter sometimes asks me why I don't go to the big church downtown, the one with the stained glass and the loud choir. I just smile and say, "Baby, God don't need a mansion to speak. Sometimes he hides in whispers." Then I take her hand, and we sit together on the porch, humming old hymns while the world keeps spinning. That's the legacy I leave. Not bitterness, not revenge, just truth, strength, and the soft, steady power of a woman who stood through the storm and found her voice again, not inside a sanctuary, but in the wilderness where no one thought she'd survive. And I did. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel and stay with us for the next story. It's already waiting for you on the screen. Because every story told by a grandmother carries the strength of generations. Click and keep listening. We'll be right here.